The cabin was peaceful. Passengers relaxed in their seats, some watching movies, others flipping through magazines or chatting quietly with their seatmates. The hum of the engines was steady, a comforting background sound as Flight 729 cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet. It was just another ordinary flight until it wasn't. A sudden jolt of turbulence sent a ripple of gasps through the cabin. A woman's drink spilled onto her lap, and a flight attendant nearly lost her balance as she walked down the aisle. The overhead lights flickered for a moment before stabilizing. Then came the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a bit of turbulence, but there's no cause for alarm." His voice cut off mid-sentence. Silence followed. A few passengers exchanged nervous glances. The intercom remained dead, the usual reassurance that followed turbulence. "Everything is under control," never came. Something was wrong. Seated near the front of the plane, Liam Parker, a 13-year-old boy, looked up from his handheld gaming console. He had always been fascinated by airplanes, spending hours on flight simulators at home. He knew a little about flying, more than most kids his age, but at this moment, none of that seemed relevant. To him, it was just another bumpy ride. Then, the real panic began. A flight attendant rushed toward the cockpit, her face pale and stricken with fear. She banged on the door. "Captain? First officer?" No answer. She grabbed the intercom and spoke quickly, trying to mask the tremble in her voice. "If there is a doctor on board, please report to the front immediately." Whispers spread through the cabin. A doctor, an elderly man in a navy blazer, made his way to the front. The flight attendant hesitated for a second before opening the cockpit door slightly. What he saw inside made his breath hitch. The pilot and co-pilot were slumped over in their seats, completely unconscious. Gasps of horror filled the front rows as the news traveled fast. The realization struck like lightning. There was no one flying the plane. Oxygen masks suddenly dropped from the ceiling as the plane's altitude began to waver. The automated system had detected something was wrong. A woman screamed. A baby started crying. The flight attendants tried to keep passengers calm, but it was clear chaos had taken over. Liam's heart pounded. He looked around at the terrified faces, his mother gripping the armrest beside him, his little sister clutching her stuffed toy with wide, fearful eyes. No pilot, no control, no one to land the plane. Then, amidst the chaos, a single thought formed. In Liam's mind, a wild, impossible, terrifying thought. "I know how to fly a plane, kind of." What happened next would make history. Liam Parker had always been different from other kids his age. While most of his friends were obsessed with video games and sports, Liam was fascinated by one thing: airplanes. From the moment he saw his first cockpit on a family trip when he was 6, he was hooked. His room was filled with airplane models, posters of jets and books about aviation. But his true passion was flight simulators. Every evening after school, Liam would sit at his computer, gripping his joystick, navigating digital skies. He knew the controls by heart: the altitude, thrust, flaps, and landing gear. He spent hours watching pilot training videos online, studying how real pilots handled different emergencies. He didn't just play, he learned. But Liam never thought his knowledge would be useful outside the virtual world. Not until that fateful day. Liam was traveling with his mother, Sarah Parker, and his little sister, Emily, on a flight from New York to London. Their father, a marine engineer, worked overseas, and they visited him whenever they could. This trip was special. Emily's 7th birthday was coming up, and their father had promised to celebrate with them in London. Liam sat by the window staring at the clouds. His mother was next to him, reading a book, while Emily was busy coloring in her sketchbook. It was supposed to be a normal flight. The airplane, Flight 729, was piloted by Captain James Reynolds, a seasoned professional with over 20 years of experience. His co-pilot, Mark Davies, was younger but skilled. They had safely guided countless flights across the Atlantic. No one had any reason to worry until everything went wrong. The trouble started subtly. First, a slight turbulence shook the plane. Nothing alarming, just a minor disturbance. Passengers barely noticed. Then, a second jolt, stronger this time, sent drinks spilling, heads jerking up in concern. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds and co-pilot Davies exchanged worried glances. The turbulence didn't match the weather reports. The skies were supposed to be clear. "Strange," Reynolds muttered. Adjusting the controls, Davies checked the instruments. "Everything looks normal, no storm ahead." A minute passed. Then out of nowhere, Davies' vision blurred. A wave of dizziness washed over him. He blinked, trying to focus, but his body felt heavy. "Captain," he mumbled, struggling to keep his hands steady. Reynolds turned to him, alarmed. "What's wrong?" But before Davies could respond, his head slumped forward onto the controls. The captain barely had time to react before a sudden weakness overtook him too. His vision swam. His limbs refused to move. He collapsed in his seat, unconscious. Cockpit was silent except for the hum of the engines and the flashing alarms. The pilots were out, and the plane was still flying. Back in the cabin, Liam was absorbed in his game, unaware of the disaster unfolding ahead. But when the turbulence returned, harder, sharper, he looked up. Something was wrong. Then came the captain's voice over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a bit of turbulence, but there's no cause for alarm." The voice cut out. Silence. Liam glanced at his mother. "Why did he stop talking?" Sarah frowned. "I don't know. Maybe it's just a technical issue," passengers murmured, confused. Then a flight attendant rushed toward the cockpit. The concern on her face made Liam's stomach twist. He watched as she knocked on the door. No response. She knocked harder. Still nothing. Her voice trembled. "Captain? First officer?" No reply. A doctor among the passengers, an elderly man in a navy blazer, was called to the front. The flight attendant hesitated. Before unlocking the cockpit door, the doctor gasped. The pilots were unconscious. That was when the panic truly began. Passengers started shouting. A woman sobbed into her hands. A man demanded answers. The flight attendants tried to keep everyone calm, but fear spread like wildfire. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The plane was still in the air, but without a pilot. How long would that last? Liam's mind raced. He had read about aviation accidents before. He knew that modern planes had autopilot systems, but those wouldn't last forever. Someone had to take control. His mother gripped his hand. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, but her voice wavered. She was trying to reassure herself, as much as him. Emily clutched her stuffed bunny, her eyes wide with fear. Liam's heart pounded. He turned toward the cockpit. He could see the flashing lights, the chaotic controls, the seat where the captain sat. He wasn't a real pilot, but he had flown hundreds of hours on a simulator, and right now there was no one else. A flight attendant, Rachel Carter, was desperately trying to get a response from ground control. The radio crackled. "Flight 729, come in. Who's flying the aircraft?" Rachel's voice trembled. "The pilots, they're unconscious. We have no one to fly the plane." A moment of horrified silence followed. Then a man's voice, calm but urgent, came through. "This is Daniel Carter, Air Traffic Control. Do you have anyone at all who knows anything about flying?" Rachel's breath caught. Nobody. Then Liam stood up. "I can fly," he said. His voice was small but firm. Rachel turned to him, eyes wide. "What?" "I know how to fly. Kind of," Liam said, stepping forward. "I play flight simulators. I know the basics." Rachel hesitated. The fate of 200 passengers couldn't be placed in the hands of a child. Could it? But what choice did they have? She swallowed hard, then nodded. "Liam, Get in the cockpit." And just like that, the fate of the flight rested in the hands of a 13-year-old boy. The cockpit was eerily quiet. The steady hum of the engines filled the space, but the two men who were supposed to be in control, Captain James Reynolds and co-pilot Mark Davies, lay slumped over in their seats, completely unconscious. Alarms flashed on the control panel. The autopilot had kicked in, keeping the plane steady for now, but it wouldn't last forever. Outside the cockpit, the scene was pure chaos. Passengers shouted questions at the flight attendants, demanding answers they didn't have. A woman in first class sobbed, clutching her husband's arm. A man near the emergency exit gripped his seat so tightly his knuckles turned white. People were scared. They had every reason to be. Liam Parker stood frozen near the cockpit door. His heart pounded in his chest as his mind processed what was happening. The pilots were out. No one was flying the plane. His mother, Sarah, grabbed his arm. "Liam, stay with me," she said, her voice shaking. She looked down at Emily, who was squeezing her stuffed bunny, her face pale. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, but even she didn't sound convinced. Liam's hands clenched into fists. He could hear the flight attendants frantically speaking into the radio, trying to get help from the ground. Could they land the plane remotely? Could they send instructions? Then came the words that made everyone's blood run cold. "This is air traffic control," a voice crackled over the radio. "Flight 729, you need to listen carefully. If we don't regain control soon, the plane will begin to lose altitude. We need someone to take control of the aircraft." A horrified silence spread through the cabin. "Someone has to fly the plane," one man muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel Carter, the lead flight attendant, turned to her crew, searching for any sign of hope. "Does anyone here have a flight experience? A pilot, a retired officer, anyone?" Nothing. Liam swallowed hard. He wasn't a real pilot, but he had spent hundreds of hours in flight simulators. He understood how planes worked. He knew what the controls did. Could he really do it? His heart pounded. He took a deep breath, then stepped forward. "I can help," he said, his voice firm. Rachel turned, blinking in surprise. "What?" "I know how to fly." "Kind of," Liam repeated. "I've played flight simulators. I know the controls. I can at least try." A tense silence followed. Rachel's eyes searched his face. A 13-year-old? Could she really trust a kid to fly a plane? But what choice did they have? She exhaled sharply, then grabbed his arm. "Come with me." The cockpit smelled of sweat and metal. The pilots were unconscious, their breathing shallow. The doctor knelt beside them, trying to assess their condition. But the biggest problem remained. No one was in control of the plane. Liam's hands trembled as he stepped inside. This was real. No computer screen, no joystick in his bedroom. This was an actual cockpit, filled with blinking lights, buttons and switches. Rachel handed him the radio. "Talk to air traffic control. Tell them who you are." Liam licked his lips and pressed the button. "This is Liam Parker," he said, his voice cracking slightly. I'm 13. The pilots are unconscious. I don't know what to do." A pause. Then a calm, deep voice came through the speaker. "Hello, Liam. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm with Air Traffic Control. We're going to help you. Do you see the control panel in front of you?" Liam took a deep breath. "Yes." "Good. Do not touch anything yet. The autopilot is still engaged, but it won't last forever. I need you to check something for me. Look for a switch labeled Auto Throttle." Liam's eyes scanned the panel. There were so many buttons. His mind felt like it was spinning. But then, there. Auto Throttle. "I see it," he said. "Good. Do not turn it off yet. Just keep your hands away from it. We need to stabilize the altitude before anything else." Liam nodded, even though Daniel couldn't see him. "Now look at the screen in front of you. You should see numbers. Altitude, heading, and speed. Tell me what they say." Liam read the numbers aloud, his hands sweating. "Okay," Daniel said. The plane is maintaining altitude for now, but you're off course. We need to make adjustments. Can you see the control yoke? Liam looked at the large steering wheel-like control. Yes, that's what you'll use to steer. But first, we need to check the fuel levels. Liam's heart pounded. This was real. This was happening. His mother's voice echoed in his head. It's going to be okay. But was it? He didn't have time to think. The plane gave another lurch. The oxygen mask swayed from the ceiling. Passengers gasped. Liam, listen to me, Daniel said firmly. You can do this. We're going to land this plane together. Liam exhaled shakily. His fingers gripped the control yoke. He wasn't a pilot. He wasn't even old enough to drive a car. But right now, he was the only hope they had. The cockpit felt larger than life. The glowing buttons, the endless switches, the massive screens. It was overwhelming. Liam's fingers trembled as he hovered them over the controls. His breathing was uneven, his chest tight. He wasn't supposed to be here. A kid in a cockpit, controlling an actual airplane? It didn't feel real. Behind him, Rachel stood frozen, watching him with uncertainty. The doctor was still trying to revive the pilots, but they remained motionless. The faint hum of their breathing was the only sign of life. The radio crackled. Liam, this is Daniel Carter from Air Traffic Control. I need you to focus. You're doing great so far. We're going to help you, but we need to move fast. The autopilot is keeping you steady, but you're slightly off course. We need to adjust your heading. Can you do that? Liam swallowed. He knew what heading meant. It was the direction of the plane, measured in degrees. On his flight simulator at home, he adjusted the heading all the time. But this wasn't a game. If he got it wrong, people could die. I'll try, he said, his voice shaky. Good. Look for the heading control. It should be a dial marked HDG on the autopilot panel. Turn it slightly to the right, just a few degrees. Liam scanned the buttons. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then he saw it. HDG. His fingers twitched as he reached for it. Carefully, he turned the dial 2 clicks to the right. Rachel leaned forward. Did that do anything? The radio crackled again. Perfect, Liam. Your course is correcting. Keep your hands steady. You're doing fine. Liam exhaled, but his relief didn't last long. The plane suddenly dipped. The passengers screamed. Overhead compartments rattled. The whole aircraft lurched. Downward. Liam, what's happening? Rachel cried. His eyes darted to the altitude display. The numbers were dropping. They were losing altitude. Liam, listen to me, Daniel said urgently. I need you to pull back slightly on the control yoke. Not too hard. Just enough to level out. Liam grabbed the yoke with sweaty hands. His mind raced, flashing back to the hours he had spent in his flight simulator. The nose of the plane had dipped. He had to correct it. He took a deep breath, then gently pulled back. The plane shuddered but leveled out. A collective gasp of relief filled the cabin. Liam, you're a natural, Daniel's voice said, his tone a little lighter now. You stabilized it. That was incredible. Liam's hands shook. Natural? He didn't feel like one. His body felt like it had been dumped into ice water. I don't know how much longer I can do this, he whispered. Rachel put a hand on his shoulder. You're not alone. We're with you. Liam swallowed hard and nodded. But the crisis wasn't over yet. In the cabin, Sarah Parker held Emily close. She had never felt so helpless in her life. The idea that her 13-year-old son was the only one flying this plane was terrifying. A man in the row behind her leaned forward. Is there really no one else? No backup pilot? A flight attendant shook her head, her expression grim. We're trying to contact any off-duty pilots on board, but so far no one has stepped up. Sarah's hands tightened into fists. She looked toward the cockpit door, barely able to see Liam's small frame inside. She had to believe in him, but could she? Inside the cockpit, Liam barely had time to catch his breath. All right, Liam, Daniel said. We need to check on your fuel levels. Can you see a gauge labeled fuel flow? Liam scanned the instruments. He found it. His stomach dropped. Daniel, it looks low, really low. Silence on the radio, then a deep breath. Okay, we don't have much time. We need to find an emergency landing site. Liam, listen very carefully. I need you to check your navigation screen. Look for the closest airport. Liam's fingers trembled as he pressed a few buttons, navigating the screen. Finally, an airport code appeared. EGKK, Gatwick Airport. Got it. Good. Gatwick is your best option. It's a busy airport, but it has long runways. You need to start descending now, Liam. Liam's stomach twisted. Descend. Landing was the hardest part of flying. Even real pilots struggled with it. I don't think I can do that, he admitted. You can, Daniel reassured him. I'll walk you through it. Liam bit his lip. He had no choice. It was do or die. "Okay," he whispered. "Tell me what to do." Liam, first step, reduce your speed. Look for the throttle levers. Pull them back slightly. Liam found them. His fingers hesitated, then carefully pulled the levers back. The plane shuddered as the engines slowed. Good. Now, lower your altitude gradually. Don't pull too hard. Ease into it. Liam nudged the yoke forward. The nose of the plane dipped. Gently this time, Daniel's voice came through again. You're descending smoothly, Liam, just like that. Liam felt his breath hitch. He was really doing this. Rachel let out a shaky laugh. You're incredible, kid. Liam didn't answer. His focus was razor sharp. The runway was still far, but for the first time he felt like he had a chance. Back in the cabin, Sarah watched the passengers. Some were praying, others clutched their loved ones. The fear was palpable. A flight attendant approached her. Your son he's amazing. Sarah blinked away tears. He's never been in a real cockpit before. Well, the attendant said, he's the only reason we're still in the air. Sarah's chest tightened. Come on, Liam, you can do this. The runway lights appeared in the distance. Liam, this is it, Daniel said. You're approaching the airport. We're going to land this thing. Liam's hands tightened on the yoke. His entire body was shaking. Talk me through it, he whispered. Flaps down, landing gear down, maintain speed, Daniel instructed. Liam followed every word. The wheels locked into place. The ground rushed. Up to meet them. The entire plane held its breath. Liam's knuckles turned white as he prepared for the most terrifying moment of his life. The landing. The glowing runway lights were still far in the distance, but they were getting closer every second. Liam's heart pounded as he gripped the yoke, his palms sweaty. This was it, the moment where everything he had done so far would be tested. The only thing standing between them and disaster was his ability to land the plane. Daniel's voice came through the radio, steady and calm. All right, Liam, you're approaching the airport. We're going to do this together. Just follow my instructions, one step at a time. Liam nodded, though no one could see him. His entire body trembled with fear. Rachel knelt beside him, her hand still on his shoulder. You're doing great, she whispered. He barely heard her. His focus was locked on the approaching runway. Liam, Daniel continued, first step, reduce your altitude gradually. The nose should stay slightly up. Keep the descent controlled. Liam's breath hitched. He nudged the yoke forward slightly. The plane tilted downward as it started descending toward the runway. A sudden gust of wind hit the aircraft, causing it to shake violently. Passengers screamed. Liam's stomach twisted. He gripped the yoke tighter. Daniel, he shouted, the plane's shaking. That's just the wind, Liam, Daniel reassured him. It happens during landing. Stay calm. Don't overcorrect. Just hold steady. Liam clenched his jaw and forced himself to focus. The plane trembled again, but he kept it steady. Good, Liam, Daniel said. You're doing great. Now it's time to lower the landing gear. Liam's eyes darted across the controls. His hands shook as he reached for the landing gear lever. Rachel pointed to it. There! Liam grabbed the lever and pulled it down. A loud thud echoed through the plane as the landing gear deployed. You did it, Daniel said. "The wheels are down. Now reduce your speed. Use the throttle levers and pull them back gently." Liam carefully pulled back on the throttle. The engines slowed. The plane continued its descent, closer and closer to the ground. In the cabin, Sarah Parker clutched Emily tightly. Passengers held their breath. Some were praying, others had their eyes squeezed shut. A woman near the window was crying softly. Sarah whispered, "You can do this, Liam. You're so brave." Emily buried her face in Sarah's chest, too scared to look. The tension inside the plane was unbearable. Everyone was waiting for the moment of impact. "Liam, you're almost there." Daniel's voice came through the speakers. "You need to flare the nose up slightly before you touch down. That will soften the landing, but not too much, or you'll stall." Liam's throat felt dry. His fingers ached from how tightly he was gripping the controls. 50 feet. 40 feet. 30 feet. Daniel counted down. The ground was rushing toward them. Liam pulled the yoke back just a little. 20 feet. 10 feet. Now! Liam gently pulled up on the yoke. The plane jolted violently as the wheels hit the runway. A deafening thud filled the air. The plane bounced once, twice, before settling. "Liam, hit the brakes!" Daniel yelled. Liam reached for the brake lever and yanked it back. The plane screeched, tires burning against the asphalt. Everyone in the cabin lurched forward, gripping their seats. The plane slowed, slower, until they stopped. For a moment, absolute silence. Then the cabin erupted into cheers. Passengers cried, hugged and clapped. A man pumped his fist into the air. Rachel let out a breathless laugh. "You did it," she whispered. Liam slumped in the pilot's seat, his entire body shaking. His mother's voice broke through the radio. "Liam, sweetheart, are you okay?" He squeezed. His eyes shut, his breath ragged. Then he pressed the radio button. "We're okay, Mom," he whispered. "We made it." Outside the plane, emergency vehicles raced toward them. Fire trucks, ambulances, flashing lights. It was chaos. The runway was shut down as the emergency team surrounded the aircraft. Inside, the doors opened. Paramedics rushed in, tending to passengers and checking the pilots. The doctor inside. The plane shouted, "They're stable. We need to get them to a hospital, but they're alive." More cheers filled the plane. Liam watched in a daze as people hugged each other, tears in their eyes. Rachel turned to him. "You saved us, Liam!" His mother rushed forward, tears streaming down her face. She pulled him into a tight embrace. "Oh, Liam, I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Emily wrapped her small arms around him. "You're a real pilot now, Liam." Liam chuckled weakly, his body still exhausted. "Not yet," he said, his voice hoarse. "But maybe someday." Rachel grinned. "I think you already are." Hours later, after being checked by paramedics and answering countless questions, Liam finally had a moment to himself. A reporter shoved a microphone in his face. "Liam, you just landed a commercial plane at 13 years old. How do you feel?" Liam glanced at his mother and sister, then at the runway where the plane had safely stopped. He took a deep breath and smiled. "Tired," he admitted. The crowd laughed. The story of the boy who landed a plane would spread around the world. News channels would call him a hero. Pilots would praise him. People would say he had saved 200 lives. But for Liam, it was never about being a hero. It was about staying calm, believing in himself, and never giving up. And that, he thought, was the real lesson. The plane had landed, but the nightmare wasn't over yet. Liam barely had time to process what had just happened. His hands were still trembling, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The cheers and applause around him felt distant, almost unreal. He had done it. He had landed a plane. But just as he was about to exhale in relief, a new problem emerged. Rachel's voice cut through the celebrations. "Wait, something's wrong." Liam's eyes shot up. The plane was still moving. His heart sank. The aircraft wasn't slowing down enough. Even though the wheels had touched the ground, the plane was still moving at a dangerous speed. They had braked, but not hard enough. "Liam!" Daniel's voice crackled through the radio. "You need to engage the reverse thrust. If you don't, the plane could overshoot the runway." Liam's stomach dropped. Reverse thrust. He knew what that was. It was a system that helped slow the plane down after landing, but he had never actually used it before, only read about it. "Where is it?" he asked, panic creeping into his voice. "Look for the throttle levers," Daniel said quickly. "There should be a second handle behind them. Pull them all the way back." Liam's hands fumbled over the controls. The plane was still moving too fast, and the end of the runway was getting closer. He spotted the levers. "Here goes nothing," he muttered. With all his strength, he yanked the reverse thrust handles back. A loud roar filled the cabin as the engines shifted into reverse. The plane lurched forward, throwing everyone against their seats. Passengers screamed as the aircraft violently decelerated. The entire plane shook, the metal groaning under the sudden force. Liam gritted his teeth and held on. The speed dropped. 120 knots. 180. The end of the runway was getting closer. "Liam! Press the brakes again!" Daniel shouted. Liam slammed. The brakes. The plane jerked violently one last time. Then, finally, it stopped. For a moment, silence. Then an eruption of cheers. Liam's head fell back against the seat. He let out a shaky breath, his body completely drained. They had done it. They had really done it. Outside the plane, emergency vehicles rushed forward. Sirens blared, flashing lights illuminating the dark runway. Fire trucks and ambulances surrounded the aircraft, their crews already moving into position. Inside, passengers sobbed, laughed, and hugged one another. Rachel let out a breathless laugh. "You're a legend, Liam," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. Liam couldn't even speak. He had never felt this exhausted in his life. The radio crackled. "Liam, you just saved 200 people," Daniel said. "You should be incredibly proud of yourself." Liam barely processed his words. His brain was foggy. He had been running on adrenaline for what felt like an eternity. Rachel patted his shoulder. "Come on, hero. Let's get you out of here." As soon as the doors opened, a team of paramedics rushed in. They checked the pilots first. The doctor, who had been tending to them throughout the flight, looked relieved. "They're stable," he announced. "Whatever happened to them, they should recover." Passengers filed out of the plane, some still shaky, some crying. Many stopped to thank Liam before stepping outside. A woman kissed his forehead, tears streaming down her face. "Bless you, child," she whispered. Liam's face burned with embarrassment. He had never been the center of attention before, but before he could react, his mother appeared. "Liam." Sarah ran straight to him, pulling him into the tightest hug of his life. Her body was shaking. "I was so scared," she whispered. "But you were amazing." Liam closed his eyes, letting himself melt into her embrace. Emily squeezed his arm. "You saved us, Liam," she beamed. "You're like a real pilot," Liam chuckled weakly. "Not quite," he said, his voice hoarse. Rachel smirked. "You might as well be now." Outside, the media had already gathered. Reporters and cameramen swarmed the runway, snapping pictures and shouting questions. Liam winced. He hated attention. "Who is the boy that saved Flight 729? One reporter asked. "How did a 13-year-old land a plane?" Another called. Sarah squeezed his hand. "You don't have to talk to them if you don't want to." Liam hesitated. Then a familiar voice came through the crowd. "Let the kid breathe, for crying out loud." A man in a suit and headset pushed through. His eyes locked onto Liam, his face filled with admiration. Daniel Carter, the man who had guided Liam through the scariest experience of his life. Daniel strode forward and extended his hand. "Liam Parker," he said, his voice warm. "You're one incredible kid." Liam shook his hand, feeling a strange sense of pride. "You saved 200 people today," Daniel continued. "That's something most trained pilots never even have to do." Liam swallowed hard. He still didn't feel like a hero. He had just done what needed to be done. I just didn't want us to crash," he muttered. Daniel chuckled. "Well, you did a little more than that." Liam's lips twitched into a small smile. Hours later, after countless interviews, medical checkups, and security questions, Liam finally sat down in the airport lounge. His body felt like lead. He had never been this exhausted in his life. Sarah placed a hand on his back. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Liam nodded slowly. "Just tired." Emily plopped down beside him. "You should be. You flew a whole plane." He laughed softly. "Kind of." Sarah kissed the top of his head. "We're so proud of you, Liam. Your dad is going to lose his mind when he hears about this." Liam's chest swelled with warmth. But before he could reply, his phone buzzed. He picked it up, confused. It was a message from an unknown number. "Hey, Liam, it's Daniel. If you ever want to learn how to fly for real, give me a call. You've got what it takes." Liam stared at the screen. Then, for the first time since the whole ordeal began, he smiled. Maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. The cabin was filled with nervous whispers and the quiet beeping of warning lights. The smell of burnt rubber and overheated metal lingered in the air as the plane sat motionless at the end of the runway. The passengers had stopped screaming, but their faces were still frozen in shock. Liam's hands trembled on the yoke. His heart pounded so hard. He could hear it in his ears. He had landed the plane. He had actually done it. But even as relief washed over him, his body refused to move. "Liam," Rachel said softly, kneeling beside him, "it's over. You can let go now." He hadn't realized his fingers were still gripping the controls. Slowly, he unclenched his hands. The yoke felt damp with sweat. The radio crackled. "Liam, this is Daniel. You did it, kid. You landed the plane." Liam swallowed, his throat dry. He still couldn't believe it. His brain felt numb. Is everyone okay?" he croaked. Rachel turned and peered out the cockpit door. The passengers were still in their seats, stunned but safe. Flight attendants were helping some of the elderly travelers, unbuckling seatbelts, checking for injuries. Rachel smiled. "Yeah, Liam, everyone's okay." Liam let out a shaky breath. Outside, the emergency response teams were already in motion. Ambulances and fire trucks surrounded the plane, flashing red and blue lights illuminating the runway. Airport officials scrambled to assess the situation, while paramedics prepared to assist the unconscious pilots. Inside the plane, flight attendants began guiding passengers toward the exits. Some people were crying, some were hugging each other, and others simply sat in stunned silence. Rachel helped Liam to his feet. "Come on, hero. Time to get you out of here." His legs felt like jelly. He had been sitting for hours, locked in fear and concentration. Now, the weight of exhaustion hit him like a truck. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stay standing. The moment he stepped into the cabin, all eyes turned to him. A man in the front row started clapping. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire plane erupted into applause. Cheers, whistles, people clapping their hands together so hard it echoed through the cabin. Liam's face burned red. He had never been the center of attention before. He wasn't sure he liked it. A woman grabbed his hands, squeezing them tight. "You saved my daughter," she sobbed. Thank you so much." A man patted his shoulder. "You're a hero, kid, a real-life hero." Liam didn't know what to say. His heart swelled, but his brain was too tired to process it all. Then he saw her, his mother. She was pushing through the crowd, her face streaked with tears. Emily was clutching her hand, her little eyes wide with wonder. Sarah didn't say a word. She just pulled Liam into a hug so tight he could barely breathe. "My baby," she whispered. Oh, Liam, I was so scared. I thought I lost you. Liam squeezed his eyes shut, letting himself collapse into her warmth. He felt Emily's small arms wrap around his waist, squeezing him tight. "You're the best brother in the world," Emily squeaked. Liam let out a soft, exhausted laugh. "You're just saying that because I didn't crash us." Sarah pulled back just enough to cup his face. "No," she whispered. "I'm saying it because you're the bravest person I've ever met." Liam blinked away the sting in his eyes. He wasn't sure he felt brave. He had been terrified the whole time. But looking at his mother and sister, he realized none of that mattered. They were safe. That's what counted. The passengers were finally escorted off the plane. Paramedics checked everyone for injuries, and police officers began questioning flight staff about what had happened. Liam stood to the side, watching the scene unfold. It felt like something out of a movie, a surreal, impossible, once-in-a-lifetime moment. A voice broke through his thoughts. "Let the kid through." Liam turned as Daniel Carter stepped out of a black SUV. He looked exactly how Liam had pictured. Him, tall, strong, with a headset still wrapped around his neck. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Liam. A slow grin spread across Daniel's face. "Well," he said, walking up to Liam, "you look a lot smaller than I imagined." Liam blinked. "You too," he said before he could stop himself. Daniel let out a booming laugh. "I like you, kid." Then to Liam's surprise, Daniel held out his hand. Liam stared at it for a second before shaking it. "Thanks for helping me," he said softly. "You didn't need much help," Daniel replied. "You had it in you all along." Liam's face burned again. "I was scared the whole time." "Good," Daniel said. "That means you understood the responsibility of what you were doing. Only fools aren't afraid." Liam hadn't thought of it that way. "Before," Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. "Listen, I don't know if you've ever thought about being a pilot for real, but if you do, give me a call someday. I'd be honored to fly with you." Liam's chest tightened. The thought had never seriously crossed his mind before, but maybe, just maybe. "Yeah," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'll think about it." Daniel grinned. "You do that, Captain Parker." Liam couldn't help but laugh. "I like the sound of that." Hours later, Liam and his family were finally taken to a hotel to rest. The media had already started calling him the boy who landed a plane. News crews were swarming the airport, but Liam was too exhausted to care. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his body aching all over. His mother was asleep beside Emily, who had passed out clutching her stuffed bunny. Liam's phone buzzed. "Message?" He groaned and reached for it. Unknown number. "Hey, Liam, it's Daniel. Just wanted to say one more time, you did great today. Sleep well, Captain." Liam stared at the message for a long time. Captain, his lips curled into a sleepy smile. Maybe today he wasn't just some kid who played flight simulators. Maybe today he had become something more. As exhaustion finally pulled him into sleep, one thought drifted through his mind. Maybe, just maybe, he was meant to fly. Liam woke up to the sound of his mother's voice, soft and gentle. "Liam, sweetheart, wake up." His eyelids felt heavy, like he had been asleep for days. Slowly, he blinked awake, the dim hotel room coming into focus. It wasn't a dream. The flight, the landing, the applause, it had all really happened. Emily was still curled up beside him, her tiny hand gripping his shirt. His mother sat on the edge of the bed, her face full of pride and exhaustion. "You have visitors," she said, with a smile. Liam frowned. "Who?" Before she could answer, the door opened and Daniel Carter stepped inside. "Morning, Captain," Daniel greeted, grinning. Liam sat up quickly. His muscles ached from exhaustion, but his heart skipped a beat at the title. "Captain," Daniel pulled a chair next to the bed. "I wanted to see how you were doing before I head back to the control center." Liam shrugged. "I feel tired." Daniel chuckled. "I bet you handled one of the most intense landings I've ever seen. That kind of thing would wipe out a seasoned..." Pilot! Liam wasn't sure what to say. He still couldn't believe any of it had really happened. Daniel's face grew serious. Liam, do you know what you did yesterday? Liam hesitated. I landed a plane. Daniel shook his head. You saved lives. 200 people, including your family, are alive today because of you. That's something nobody can ever take away from you. Liam swallowed hard. The weight of it all finally started to sink in. His mother put a hand on his shoulder. The doctors say the pilots are stable. They had some kind of chemical exposure in the cockpit, probably from a hidden gas leak. It knocked them out. Liam shuddered. If that leak had been worse, they might have lost them forever. Daniel leaned forward. You've got a gift, Liam. The way you stayed calm, followed instructions, and handled that landing, it's rare. Not many adults could have done what you did. Liam felt his face heat up. I was scared the whole time, he admitted. Good, Daniel said. That means you understood how serious it was. Real pilots get scared too, but they don't let fear control them. That's what makes you special. Liam looked down at his hands, still slightly shaking. He had never felt special before. But maybe he was. The next few days were a whirlwind. News crews swarmed the hotel. Reporters wanted interviews. People wanted to shake his hand, and strangers called him a hero. The story of the boy who landed Flight 729 spread like wildfire. His name was on every news channel, every website, and every newspaper, but Liam didn't care about any of that. He just wanted to go home. Finally, after what felt like forever, he and his family boarded a new flight, this time as passengers. The airline had given them first-class seats as a thank you. Liam sat by the window, staring at the clouds. For the first time, he felt peaceful. A flight attendant approached with a small envelope. This is for you, from the Pilots Association. Liam opened it, his heart skipping a beat. Inside was a letter, an offer for free flight training. Liam stared at it, his mind racing. Flight training. He had always dreamed of flying, but he had never thought it would be possible. Now he had a real chance. His mother watched him, smiling softly. What do you think, sweetheart? Liam took a deep breath, his fingers tracing over the words on the letter. Maybe, just maybe, he was meant to fly. As the plane soared through the sky, Liam smiled. His journey was just beginning.